Imagine waking up one morning, stretching beneath the warmth of your silk sheets, believing that today, just like every other day, belongs to you. Your dreams, your choices, your future, all safely in your hands. But then, in a single breath, everything changes. You were summoned, not asked, not warned, just told. You are getting married, and you have no say in it. Now, picture the man waiting at the end of that decision. Not a prince, not a man of status or charm, but a stranger, a man who has nothing, no home, no wealth, not even hope in his eyes, a man whose very existence repels you, a man society has long abandoned, and yet, he is now your husband. How would you feel? Would you fight? Would you run? Or would you stand there, trapped in a nightmare you never saw coming? This was Isabella's reality, a girl born into privilege, yet sentenced to a fate worse than she could have ever imagined. A marriage she never asked for, a husband she never wanted, a future she never chose. But here's the twist. What if I told you the man she was forced to marry wasn't who he seemed to be? That buried beneath the filth and tattered clothes was a secret, a truth so shocking, it would change her life forever. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and let's begin this unbelievable journey together. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to believe in love again. Who knows? From the outside looking in, Isabella's life was something out of a fairy tale. Born into wealth, raised in luxury, surrounded by the finest things money could buy. But what no one saw was the cold reality lurking behind the golden gates of her family's mansion. Because, in truth, Isabella was not a daughter. She was an asset, a pawn, a piece in a game played by a man who did not love her, did not cherish her, and certainly did not care about her happiness. Her father, ruthless, calculating, and unyielding, had only one vision for her life: to serve his ambitions, to be used, bartered, and, when necessary, sacrificed. She had always known she was never truly free. But even in her darkest thoughts, she never could have imagined this. It happened on an evening like any other. The grand chandeliers cast a golden glow over the dining table. The clinking of expensive silverware echoed through the air, and her father, as always, sat at the head of the table, his mere presence enough to command silence. Then, without warning, his voice sliced through the quiet. "Isabella, your wedding is in 3 weeks." The words landed like a slap. Isabella froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. Wedding? To whom? How? But before she could ask, her father continued, his voice void of warmth. "The deal has fallen through. Your original suitor backed out." For a moment, a flicker of relief passed through her. That deal, an arranged marriage to a man twice her age, a man she had never met, had been her impending doom for months. Could it be? Could she be free? But before that thought could even take root, her father spoke again. "Since no suitable groom has come forward, I have made a new decision. You will marry a beggar." The room spun. The air turned thick. A beggar? Her breath came in sharp gasps. This was a punishment. It had to be. A cruel, deliberate punishment. And the worst part? He wasn't even looking at her as he spoke. He was simply cutting his steak, as if the words that just shattered her world were nothing more than casual dinner conversation. "A girl like you needs to be humbled," he continued. "You need to learn obedience. You need to understand that your worth is not in your arrogance, but in your ability to serve." There was the truth behind his cruelty. This wasn't about teaching her a lesson. This was about breaking her, about reminding her that in his world, she was nothing but an extension of his will. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but she knew better. She had spent her entire life learning that resistance was useless. Her fate had been sealed the moment she was born. And so, 3 weeks later, she stood before the courthouse, staring at the man who was to become her husband. Daniel. Her stomach twisted as she looked at him. He was exactly what her father had promised. His clothes were tattered, worn thin by time and hardship. His hair was unkempt, falling over a face marked with exhaustion. And his eyes, they were the worst part. They were tired, weary. The kind of eyes that had seen suffering beyond imagination. He had nothing. No status. No fortune. No future. And now he was hers. The officiant's voice sounded distant, like a muffled echo in a dream. Isabella barely processed the vows. She barely felt the weight of the ring, cheap, dull, unpolished, as it slid onto her finger. Her own voice felt foreign when she whispered the words she never thought she'd say. I do. Just like that, it was done. She was no longer Isabella, daughter of wealth and privilege. She was Isabella, the wife of a homeless man, and she despised him for it. She refused to look at him as they left the courthouse. She refused to acknowledge his presence beside her. The very idea of being tied to this man made her sick. This was the lowest, most humiliating moment of her life. But what if I told you that Daniel wasn't who he seemed to be? That beneath the dirt, beneath the disguise, beneath the life of suffering was a secret so shocking, so unbelievable, it would change everything. From the moment Isabella stepped into the tiny, crumbling apartment that was now her home, she felt suffocated. The walls were dull, stained with time and neglect. The air was thick with the scent of poverty, dust, damp wood, and something she couldn't quite place. A single, flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that made the room feel even smaller. This was where she would live? The daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city, reduced to this. Her chest tightened with rage. She couldn't bear to be here. She couldn't bear to be near him. Daniel, the man she had been forced to marry. The man who had stolen what little freedom she had left. He stood in the doorway, silent, watching her. Not with amusement, not with malice, just watching, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. She turned her back to him. If she had to survive this nightmare, she would do it on her terms. She refused to acknowledge him, refused to speak to him. She wouldn't eat if he made the food, wouldn't sit if he sat. He disgusted her. The sight of him, the sound of him, the very thought of him made her stomach twist. And yet he never reacted, never complained, never lashed out. He simply carried on, quietly, patiently, as though her hatred did not wound him, as though he had known worse pain before. The first night, she lay on the worn-out mattress, staring at the ceiling, fighting the tears burning behind her eyes. This was not her life. This was not supposed to be her life. Somewhere, in a grand mansion not far from here, was the life she was meant to have. A warm bed, a feast prepared by chefs, a future paved in gold. But here, she was just another girl trapped in a place she did not belong. Her father had done this to humiliate her, to break her, to strip away her pride and dignity until there was nothing left of the woman she used to be. And Daniel? He was the tool, the punishment, the symbol of everything she had lost. She hated him for it, hated him with every breath. Days passed, then weeks, and in that time, Isabella spoke only when she had to. A nod here, a scoff there, but never anything more. Not once did she ask him a question. Not once did she try to understand the man she had been forced to share her life with. And yet, she started to notice things, little things at first, the way he spoke, with words carefully chosen, as if every syllable carried weight. He didn't sound uneducated. He didn't stumble over his sentences like she had expected. No, there was something different about him, something calculated, as though he was used to speaking to people far more powerful than himself. Then there was the way he always found food, even when they had nothing. She had expected to starve in this place, expected nights of hunger, so sharp it would keep her awake. But somehow, Daniel always returned with something. Bread, fruit, sometimes even warm meals. She never asked where he got them. She refused to care. And yet, the way he placed the food in front of her, without a word, without expectation, it gnawed at her. And then, there was the way he treated people. She had watched him give his last piece of bread to an old woman in the alley. Watched him help a struggling mother carry her things without waiting for thanks. Even when he was insulted, mocked, treated as less than human, he never raised his voice, never fought back, never reacted in anger. It frustrated her. How could someone who had nothing be so patient, so kind? It made no sense. But more than anything, it was the way he looked at her. Not with anger, not with pity, not even with resentment. No. Daniel looked at her with something else entirely. Something that sent a chill down her spine. He looked at her, as if he understood her. As if he could see straight through her walls, straight through the layers of hatred and bitterness. As if he knew exactly what she was hiding. And that terrified her. One night, everything changed. It was late. The city was quiet, the distant hum of the streets muffled by the cold night air. Isabella lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to drown out the thoughts racing in her mind. But then she heard something. Daniel's voice. Soft. Low. But not speaking to her. She turned her head, peering through the dim light. He sat by the window, a small, tattered book in his hands. His lips moved silently as he traced the words on the page. And then, without thinking, she spoke. You can read? It was the first time she had acknowledged him without spite. The words had left her mouth before she could stop them. And when he turned to look at her, she regretted them instantly. Because for the first time since they had been married, he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk, just the ghost of a smile, small and knowing, as if he had been waiting for this moment. As if he had known, all along, that she would break her silence eventually. Of course I can read, he said simply, closing the book. I can do a lot of things. His voice was calm, steady, carrying an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Confidence? Amusement? Whatever it was, it sent a strange shiver down her spine. She didn't respond. She didn't dare. But as she lay back down, her mind raced with a question she had never considered before. Who exactly was Daniel? Because something told her he wasn't just a homeless man, and whatever secret he was hiding, it was bigger than she could have ever imagined. It was supposed to be just another cold, sleepless night, like so many before it. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, eerie light through the cracks in the walls. Isabella lay awake, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and resentment. The silence of the apartment pressed down on her, making it impossible to sleep. Her mind was a storm of questions she didn't want to ask, answers she didn't want to find. Her marriage, this miserable life, it all felt like a cruel joke. A life she didn't choose, yet one she was forced to live. But on this night, everything was different. Isabella awoke with a start. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets cold, untouched. For a moment, she thought nothing of it. Daniel was always unpredictable, always silent, always withdrawn. Maybe he had gone out to get something, to find food, or maybe he just needed some space. It wouldn't be the first time, but then an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Where was he? It was so late, so quiet. She reached for the thin blanket that barely warmed her body, pulling it off and getting out of bed. The creaky floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she moved toward the window. There, in the darkened alley below, she saw something that made her freeze in her tracks. A figure, walking down the street. It was him, Daniel. But this wasn't the man she knew. This wasn't the man who had trudged home every night in torn, filthy clothes, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. No, this was something else. This man walked with a certain grace, a certain purpose, his posture straight, his steps measured, and as he moved, the streetlights caught the glint of something she hadn't expected. A black limousine, sleek, polished, and waiting at the curb. Daniel was heading toward it. Her heart skipped a beat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She could hardly breathe as she pressed herself closer to the window, her eyes wide, her mind racing. What was happening? Why was Daniel, the man she had been forced to marry, the homeless man who had nothing, getting into a luxury limousine? She watched, paralyzed by a mix of shock and disbelief, as Daniel stepped into the car with the kind of confidence she had never seen in him before. The door closed behind him, the vehicle slowly pulling away into the night. Her stomach churned as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But it was. Isabella's pulse hammered in her ears as she backed away from the window, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She felt a cold sweat cling to her skin as her mind screamed at her to make sense of it all. Daniel, the man she had been forced to marry, the man who had lived in squalor, who had suffered in silence, who had barely spoken to her, treated her with nothing but patience and kindness. He wasn't who he said he was. But why? Why had he been living as a homeless man? Why hadn't he told her? Why hadn't he revealed the truth? The questions pounded in her mind, faster and faster, until they were all she could hear. And yet, even as the anger and confusion surged inside her, another feeling gnawed at her, a feeling that had been hiding beneath her rage all along. Fear. Fear of what this meant for her. Fear of what his secret meant for their marriage. If he was a billionaire, if he had been hiding such a vast fortune all along, why had he married her? Why had he agreed to this twisted arrangement her father had made? What did he want from her? Was this all just another game? Another cruel, calculated plan? She felt betrayed. But there was something else too. Something she hadn't expected. Something that made her feel like the rug had been pulled out from under her. Daniel, this man who had been her captive for weeks, was no ordinary man. He had chosen this. He had chosen to live this way, to lie to her, to deceive her, to let her believe he was nothing. But why? With a fire igniting in her chest, Isabella grabbed her coat and rushed down the stairs, ignoring the pounding in her head, the frantic beating of her heart. She had to know the truth. She had to confront him. She couldn't live in this prison of confusion any longer. If he had lied about this, what else had he lied about? What kind of man was he? And what kind of future did she really have? As she stepped into the cold night air, the sound of her footsteps seemed deafening in the silence. Her breath fogged in front of her, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was Daniel, her husband, the man who had shattered her world. She reached the corner, peering down the dark street for any sign of the limousine. And then, in the distance, she saw it, the car slowly turning the corner, its headlights cutting through the night. Her heart raced as she stepped forward, her hand trembling as it grasped the railing. Was she really going to do this? Was she really going to follow him? But as the vehicle sped away, the answer came in an instant. She had no choice. She couldn't walk away from this. She started running, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she raced to catch up. And with every step, the reality hit her harder and harder. The man she thought was nothing but a shadow, a ghost of her father's cruelty, was more. He was so much more than she could have ever imagined. And as the distance between them closed, she had one burning question that consumed her entire being. Why had Daniel been living as a homeless man? And most terrifying of all, what did this mean for their marriage? The truth was finally out. The man she had spent weeks despising, the man she had mocked, ignored, and resented, was no ordinary man. Daniel wasn't just a homeless nobody. He wasn't a beggar, nor a man without purpose. He was powerful. He was wealthy. He was the heir to an empire so vast it could buy and sell everything she had ever known. And he had chosen to live in the shadows. Isabella stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, her breath shallow. Her mind screamed at her to make sense of it all, to demand answers. But no words came. She could only stare at him, standing there in his perfectly tailored suit, his posture relaxed yet unreadable. He was no longer the man she had pitied, no longer the man she thought she had figured out. He had deceived her, played a game she hadn't even known she was part of. And worst of all, he had won. "You lied to me," she finally choked out, her voice trembling with anger. Daniel exhaled, his gaze steady. "I never lied to you, Isabella. I just didn't tell you everything." The calmness in his voice made her blood boil. "You let me believe you were suffering, that you had nothing. And the entire time she let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You're a billionaire." He took a step closer, but she stepped back. She didn't want him near her. She didn't want to see the concern in his eyes, the quiet understanding that had always unnerved her. How could he be so calm, so controlled, when she felt like the world was crumbling beneath her feet? "I had to know, Isabella," he said softly. "I had to know if love, real love, was possible for someone like me." She scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, as if holding herself together. "Oh, and I was your little experiment then? A test?" "No." His voice was firm now, a rare flicker of emotion slipping through his mask. "You were never an experiment. You were my proof that love, real love, still exists." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears, her body torn between fury and something she didn't want to name. How dare he? How dare he make her question everything? How dare he make her feel as though the world she had hated so much was different now? You could have told me, she whispered, her voice betraying her pain. You could have trusted me. Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes locked onto hers. Would you have loved me if you had known? The question sliced through her like a blade, and she hated that she didn't have an answer. For days, she avoided him. She stayed locked away in the apartment, the weight of the truth pressing down on her like a vice. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. The way he had looked at her that night. The way his words had shaken her to her core. Would you have loved me if you had known? The answer should have been easy. She should have said no. She should have screamed it. But something held her back. Something terrifying. Because somewhere between the arguments, the silent stares, the nights of unspoken words, she had changed. She had fallen in love with a man who had nothing. The man who had been patient, who had seen her when no one else did. The man who had never asked her for anything. She had fallen in love with the man who had shown her a world outside the golden prison she had once called home. But now she wasn't sure who he was anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, there was a knock at the door. She knew it was him before she even opened it. Daniel stood there, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen before. I won't force you to stay, he said. If you want to leave, if you want to pretend none of this ever happened, I won't stop you. Her heart clenched. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him he had no right to make this decision easy for her. But instead, she just stared at him, at the man who had turned her world upside down. And if I stay? She asked quietly. His jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't look away. Then stay because you want to, not because you have to. The words settled between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Isabella swallowed hard, her fingers tightening against the doorframe. She hated him for what he had done, hated him for making her question herself. But most of all, she hated that she already knew her answer. She wasn't leaving, because despite everything, despite the lies and the deception, she had found something she never thought she would. She had found love. Just when Isabella thought she had finally found peace, fate had one last cruel twist to offer. Her father returned. It was late in the evening when the knock came at the door. A sharp, demanding sound that echoed through the small apartment. Isabella's heart sank. She knew, somehow, she knew, before she even opened it. And there he was, the man who had controlled her life from the moment she was born. The man who had treated her like a pawn in his never-ending game of power and wealth. But tonight he wasn't just angry. No, tonight he was furious. You lied to me, he seethed, stepping into the room without invitation. His sharp eyes scanned the modest space with open disgust. You married a beggar. You disgraced our name. And now you tell me he's not even who he pretended to be? Isabella squared her shoulders, her hands trembling at her sides. I didn't lie. You forced me into this marriage. And now I'm making my own choices. Her father let out a low, bitter laugh. Oh, is that what you think? That you have a choice? He leaned in, his voice dangerously soft. Let me make one thing clear, Isabella. That man, Daniel, he played you, just like he played me. And now, you have two options. She swallowed hard, bracing herself. She knew whatever came next wouldn't be easy. But nothing could have prepared her for his next words. Leave him. His voice was calm, calculated. Come home. I'll pretend this never happened. I'll restore your name, your wealth, your life. No more struggling. No more disgrace. No more him. Her breath caught. A way out. A chance to return to the life she once had. The luxury, the security, the power. All she had to do was walk away. All she had to do was leave. For the briefest moment, the temptation whispered to her. No more uncertainty. No more questions about the future. She could have it all back. The beautiful gowns, the glittering parties, the comfort of knowing she would never have to worry about money again. She could forget this entire chapter of her life, pretend none of it ever happened. But then she thought of him. She thought of Daniel. The way he had looked at her with patience, even when she was cruel. The way he had never once demanded anything from her. The way he had listened, truly listened when no one else ever had. The way he had let her choose, even when it meant she might leave him. Would she trade all of that for a golden cage? Her father watched her closely, his expression unreadable. This is your last chance, Isabella. Make the right choice. The right choice. But whose definition of right? His or hers? Her heart pounded. She could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on her, suffocating her. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. And so, with a deep, steadying breath, she lifted her chin and looked her father in the eye. I have made my choice. His eyes narrowed. Isabella. No, her voice was firm, unwavering. You don't control me anymore. I'm not a piece of your empire to be traded. I choose him. Silence. Heavy. Unyielding. Then her father's face twisted in disgust. You're a fool. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart racing, her hands shaking, but her soul feeling lighter than it had in years. She had chosen love, not wealth, not comfort, not power, just love. And what do you think happened next? The words trembled on Isabella's lips, fragile yet powerful. She had spent so long fighting her own heart, denying what had become so painfully clear. But now there was no more fear, no more doubt, only the truth that had been waiting to be spoken. Her voice wavered, thick with emotion. I love you. Daniel's breath hitched, his eyes searching hers, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. For weeks, he had been patient. He had given her space, never asking for anything she wasn't ready to give. And now, at last, she was giving him everything. Say it again, he whispered, his voice barely audible. A tear slipped down her cheek as she smiled, something inside her finally breaking free. I love you, Daniel. Not because of your money, not because of who you are to the world. I love you because you saw me. You truly saw me. For the first time in his life, Daniel, strong, composed, unshakable Daniel, felt his control slip. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she was the only thing keeping him grounded. And maybe she was. The world around them had tried to pull them apart. Fate had tested them in every way possible. But in the end, none of it mattered. Not the past, not the wealth, not the scars they both carried. All that mattered was this: a love that had survived the impossible, a love that was real. And so, they built a life, not one made of gold and diamonds, but one made of laughter, of trust, of quiet moments that spoke louder than words. They built a life where love was not measured by what they had, but by what they shared, because perhaps, just perhaps, love isn't about where you start. It isn't about wealth or status. It isn't about perfect timing or grand gestures. Love is about choosing someone every single day, even when the world gives you every reason not to. And Isabella and Daniel, they chose each other till the very end. Now, tell me, do you believe in love like this? Would you choose love over wealth, over power, over comfort? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it, who needs to believe in love again. Because maybe, just maybe, love like this still exists,